South Korean workers held in a US immigration swoop, the latest jolt to a once rock-solid relationship. Turbulence too over tariffs and military spending. Is the raid a one-off or a sign of deeper trouble between the two nations? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. Shock in South Korea after hundreds of its citizens are arrested in a US immigration swoop while working on the construction of a factory in Georgia for Korean industrial giants LG and Hyundai. Although a deal has enabled their return home, it won't ease jitters in Seoul over its relationship with the United States. Once the firmest of allies, major US military support has helped Seoul to counter neighbouring North Korea and nearby China. South Korea is a global powerhouse for technology and industry, and the US is a major trading partner. But under US President Donald Trump, their relationship has been rocked. The imposition of stiff tariffs surprised Seoul, and although they were later reduced under a deal, it came with billion-dollar strings attached. Trump's also long called for South Korea to spend more on defence, just as he's courted its biggest threat, North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un. So what's happening between the two allies? Was the immigration raid a one-off, a federal agency just doing its work, as Trump says? Or is it a sign of deeper difficulties? We'll find out more from our guest shortly. But first, a report from Joel Evans.
Cracking down on immigration was a central plank of US President Donald Trump's election campaign. Now it's being enforced with zeal by immigration and customs enforcement agents since his return to office in January. ICE agents conducted their biggest ever raid on a single location on Thursday on a construction site owned by Hyundai LG in the state of Georgia. At least 475 people were arrested, most of them South Korean nationals working on completing a factory.
Homeland Security investigations, in coordination with our law enforcement partners, executed a judicial search warrant as part of an ongoing criminal investigation into allegations of unlawful employment practices and serious federal crimes.
Despite meeting the South Korean president on the 25th of August and agreeing a trade deal in July, President Trump claimed he knew nothing about the raid.
I just heard about that a little while before the news conference, and I would say that they were illegal aliens, and ICE was just doing its job.
South Korea's foreign ministry expressed concern.
The
economic activities of our companies investing in the United States and the interests of our citizens must not be unduly violated during the course of US law enforcement.
On Sunday, South Korea announced a deal had been reached to fly the workers home.
As a result of swift and united efforts by government ministries, business groups and companies, talks with the United States for the release of the detained workers have been concluded. But what remains now are only administrative procedures, and once those are completed, a chartered plane will depart and bring our people home.
The raid came shortly after an agreement was reached on trade tariffs that have also shocked Seoul. Despite being a long-term ally of the US, South Korea was initially hit with tariffs of 25%, reduced to 15% after negotiations that included the country pledging to invest $350 billion in US projects. According to the UN, South Korea was the biggest investor in the US 2 years ago, ploughing more than $21 billion into projects. But a trading surplus in Seoul's favor has made it a target for Donald Trump. The two have also been strong military allies since the Korean War in the early 1950s, but as well as trade, this too has come under pressure. Trump, in both his terms in office, has demanded Seoul pay more for its defense. His close relationship with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is also a source of anxiety in Seoul. Political and business leaders in Seoul are now wondering whether the ICE raid in Georgia is a one-off, or a sign of more trouble to come in its relations with the US. Joel Evans, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. From Seoul, we're joined by Se-Woong Koo, founder of Korea Expose, an online magazine specialising in Korean news. From Philadelphia, we're joined by Jenny Town, Senior Fellow at the Stimson Center and Director of its Korea Programme and 38 North. And also in Seoul is Youngshik Bong, visiting professor at Yonsei University. A warm welcome to you all. Se-Woong Koo, let's start with you. What's been the reaction to this raid there in South Korea? What are people and politicians saying?
Well, there has been a huge amount of shock, certainly, at the fact that people who seem to have gone on a business trip to the US have suddenly ended up behind bars. And that's something that I don't think many companies like LG or Hyundai could have expected. And certainly the reaction we have seen from the politics here has been quite strong and also vocal. The government certainly has said that it will do its best to protect the nation's interest and also protect the business activities of the Koreans and Korean companies. And in fact, it seems like it has been making significant effort to secure the release of these people, judging by the fact that just today, about 3-4 hours ago, we heard an announcement from the presidential office that the release of those who are now in detention in the US has been secured and a plane will be sent over to pick them up. What is also interesting to hear from the government is that, in fact, it says there needs to be more done to ensure that the visas for Koreans who go on a business to the US in the future must be reviewed to ensure that they are in fact correct and legal from the perspective of the US government.
Jenny, how much harm will this incident have caused to US-South Korea relations, especially as the two nations at the moment are currently negotiating the final details of this trade deal? I wonder, does this incident actually give either side any leverage in those negotiations?
I think it's definitely going to impact the trade negotiations, and especially this $350 billion investment package. I'm sure South Korean companies are now rethinking what it is that they actually can do or want to do with the U.S. given this environment. I think there's still a lot of details that we don't know about what prompted the raid and if this was part of a negotiation tactic. I think there's some reporting that's suggesting that one of the charges and one of the allegations is actually conspiracy to conceal some of these immigration practices. And so it might be something more than what we've seen in other kind of ICE raids, and might have been actually prompted separate from the negotiations. But either way, one, it's good that that they were able to release and secure the release of those 300 Koreans so quickly, but it is going to be problematic in trying to get South Korean companies to trust in and reinvest in the U.S.
Youngshik, will this raid affect South Korean public sentiment about this trade deal that the US and South Korea are currently negotiating, and whether the South is actually getting a fair deal here? What are the risks that this could further fuel anti-US sentiment in South Korea?
Yeah, this is very much reminiscent of the rise of anti-American sentiment in South Korea, although South Korea and the United States have been very stalwart allies since the days of the Korean War and throughout the Cold War, as well as very important trading partners for a long, long time. The Bush administration's war in Iraq and the pressure on South Korea to make a military contribution to that effort really ignited anti-American sentiment at that time. But the anti-American sentiment has been subsided by mutual effort. But this type of incident would risk another surge of anti-American sentiment in South Korea if this type of incident is going to happen again.
Se-Woong Koo, President Trump claimed to have no prior knowledge of the raid, as we saw. Do people there in South Korea believe that? Do they think perhaps the raid was part of a pressure campaign on South Korea, a broader signal of hostility towards South Korea and the companies that are currently operating in the US?
Well, what has been reported is certainly that this investigation into the factory in Georgia has been going on for quite some time. The U.S. immigration authorities seem to have collected considerable evidence against the labor practices of Korean companies, including LG, Hyundai, and various subcontractors. So we cannot really guess as to whether President Trump really knew of this was happening, but at the very least, the U.S. government certainly has been looking into what is going on for a very long time. As to whether this will elicit a hostile reaction within South Korea toward the U.S., that is not something that we have seen so far. In fact, what it has done is to put enormous pressure on the current president of South Korea, Lee Jae-myung, and also the current administration as to why it was not able to negotiate with the U.S. in a better way while working out this so-called trade deal and the investment agreement. In fact, what should have been done is for the South Korean government to ensure that the companies, Korean companies and Korean business people who are going to the US in order to make these investments should be better protected and should be given an opportunity to get the kind of visas they need in order to work in the US without fearing any repercussions from these immigration officials.
So you're saying
what we know is that
I'm sorry to interrupt you. You're saying that this has become something of a political issue, even if the public are laissez-faire about it. Opposition politicians using it to criticise the government's handling of the Trump administration.
Absolutely. There was a considerable deal being made out of the fact that South Korea seems to have gotten a very preferential treatment from the Trump administration, judging by what seems to be relatively low tariffs that the U.S. is now imposing on South Korean imports. And not long after that, we're seeing a situation where this very prominent factory in the U.S., which is a joint venture of the two of the most prominent conglomerates from South Korea, seems to be being targeted by U.S. officials. So it seems to contradict the kind of statement that the government here has made about how effective and successful it has been in dealing with President Trump over trade issues.
Jenny, if the workers who were arrested were present illegally or working illegally in the US, then their arrests were entirely justified, weren't they?
Well, yes, if they were illegal. And it does sound like there's some questions about the visa status of some of the workers that claim to be under the visa waiver program, which does allow for both tourism and business. But the scope of what's considered a business purpose is very narrow. It usually means going to conferences or events, something business related, but not actual employment and not actual work in the United States. So if that is actually what happened, and there were several people on the visa waiver program that were working in this factory, it would become a target. But it does feel like, even if this wasn't part of a negotiation, a strong-arm negotiation strategy, like I said, like others have said, it's been going on. The investigations have supposedly gone on for quite some time now. But it does seem like they're using this particular case as an example for other foreign companies who are also investing in the United States. I think it's unfortunate that it happened to be a Korean company at this particular time when there are negotiations going on, but it could very well be separate from that political process.
OK, we'll talk more about South Korean investment in the US in just a few moments. But first, Youngshik, how much responsibility does Hyundai, does LG bear for what seems to have become a diplomatic incident? I mean, should have been more diligent over the way in which it hires contractors, they hire contractors and subcontractors to make absolutely sure that undocumented workers weren't working on its projects.
Well, those Korean corporations will do their own due diligence to look back what went wrong, and they will try to correct the problems. But there is a separate question. The United States government can make all the legal arguments to justify their raid. But the problem is that the Trump administration does not appear to see the whole picture, to keep different priorities of America First policy, which not just include the border security and kicking out the illegal immigrants from the homeland. But the America First policy of the Trump administration also needs to resuscitate the manufacturing industry of the United States economy and bring in foreign investment. So these priorities may be contradicting each other. And what is missing is the conductor to manage the orchestra to put these different priorities in harmony. I mean, the Trump administration has been failing to achieve these many multiple goals, but I mean, there are conflicting each other. So what is missing is coordination at the very high level of the Trump administration.
Se-Woong Koo, is anyone there in Seoul critical of Hyundai and LG's role in all of this?
Yeah, I think at least certain employees of these companies have been voicing opinions anonymously, certainly, but definitely vocally online, that these companies have not gone far enough to protect their workers or the workers hired by the subcontractors. This practice of bringing Koreans into the US for work purposes on visas that may not entirely be appropriate for the work being done has been such a long-standing practice that many companies have tried to do the same, and they have gotten away with it in the past, but certainly with the harder line that the Trump administration is taking on immigration, this is no longer tenable. But that also raises the question. Trump administration has said many times, we want a lot of investment to be made in the US by these big foreign companies. But when this investment is coming, it may also require technical experts to come and implement these new projects. Like taking, for instance, this battery factory that is being constructed in Georgia. It's not just an issue of having laborers building a facility. You need real experts to come, and they may be hundreds of them, and actually set up the process for producing something that is very specific. And the US government needs to ensure that these people have a way to come and work in the US for how long it takes for the factory to be established. And that's certainly something that the US government does not seem to do, even as it demands that more investment come from the foreign countries like South Korea.
Jenny, that's a reasonable argument, isn't it? If the expertise needed to complete the construction of a plant isn't available in the US, what is wrong with companies sending their own expertise if those people are being paid into South Korean bank accounts and not taking the jobs of Americans?
Well, that is the tension here of what is considered, good investment. If you have foreign companies that are coming to the U.S. And hiring mostly foreign workers, then you have local communities watching this going, well, how does this benefit us? So when it comes to this America First kind of policy, there's definitely tensions there about what is an appropriate mix of this immigration for business purposes versus encouraging companies to hire local workers. And that hasn't been worked out. And I think, this is one of those things where the other factory, the Hyundai, the auto plant that's in Georgia as well, is beloved by the community, where they are very much employing local workers once the factory is set up. And so the question is for this particular project, how much was this of technical expertise, and how was that portrayed to the community? And I think there's some discrepancies there that we simply don't know about, but that are hinted at in some of these in some of the indictments.
Yeah, Youngshik, let's talk about the perhaps the long-term fallout of this. Okay, it might have been a one-off incident, but could it somehow have implications for the what? $350 billion worth of investments that South Korean companies have pledged or perhaps had their arm twisted to make in the US as part of the trade deal struck in July. Will South Korean companies now perhaps reconsider large-scale US investments?
Well, I guess the option is not really available for South Korean corporations, but at least they can take advantage of this unfortunate incident to justify their very cautious and conservative decision in terms of actually making the investment in the United States and set up factories. These corporations could argue toward their own government in South Korea and the US government that, listen, in order for us to keep our pledges of a massive investment in the United States, we need legal protection so that this type of incident will not repeat itself. That's kind of a weapon of the weak for these corporations in South Korea. And speaking of the political implication of this incident, it might be just a one-off incident from legal perspective if the both government would come up with an effective visa arrangement for South Korean workers in the future. But the impact has been already made to South Korean viewers about the bullying behavior of the United States. So the suspicion that Lee Jae-myung government has made secret concessions to the Trump administration, judging from the fact that the summit meeting did not produce any official joint statement, and there's no official document about the mutual agreement on the U.S. tariff on South Korea and Korea. So such a suspicion will be exacerbated in South Korean public.
Se-Woong Koo, do you agree with that? I mean, how does the public feel about the US right now? What is the sentiment? How worried are the country's politicians? We talked about the imposition of these stiff tariffs, all right, later reduced, the calls by the Trump administration for South Korea to spend more on defense, the courting by the Trump administration of the North Korean leader. How do people feel about the relationship between the US and South Korea? Is it beginning to weaken?
I think it's safe to say that there has been concern building in South Korea about Mr. Trump's intentions toward this country, and that the kind of actions he has taken, including this immigration raid on the factory in Georgia, is compounding that impression, and it certainly has generated chatter that perhaps Washington is not as reliable as it was once thought to be before Mr. Trump took power. But of course, there are things that the current government of South Korea and Mr. Trump do agree on, and that may be on how to deal with North Korea. Let's not forget that it is the previous South Korean president, Moon Jae-in, who comes from the same party as the current president of Korea, Lee Jae-myung. During the tenure of Mr. Moon, Mr. Trump also showed great interest in working with Kim Jong-un of North Korea, and those high-level summits did take place, and this is something that the government of South Korea at the time very much supported. And after the current president of South Korea, Lee Jae-myung, took power, certainly we have seen momentum toward reestablishing ties with North Korea that were frayed while the conservative Yoon Suk-yeol was in the presidential office. So there is certainly enough room for the two countries to still work together on. That said, there are also clear differences, for example, about China and how much South Korea should be assisting Washington in countering Chinese influences in the region, and how much should the US military on South Korean soil be able to participate in any kind of military action that may be aimed at Chinese forces. Those areas are certainly going to be problematic as the tenure of the South Korean president today continues, and as long as Mr. Trump is in power at the same time.
Jenny, do you agree with that? Given the fuss that this has caused, the diplomatic controversy, does this raid suggest that US immigration enforcement agencies are ignoring the sensitivities of targeting high-profile projects linked to allied nations who are investing billions in the economy? Or were they just doing their job?
I think that's the question, right? The underlying question here is, again, whether it was politically motivated to do this as part of a negotiating strategy, or if it was really evidence-based that drove this whole situation. Again, it was done differently than most other ICE raids on companies. It was a long-term investigation. There were actual judicial warrants, which doesn't usually happen when they do these things. And so it does seem to indicate that, again, it may be the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, and that this just happened to happen all at the worst possible time in the negotiation in prospects. But I think it's important to remember, look, we're less than a year into the Trump administration, the second Trump administration. And so while there may not be tectonic shifts yet in how South Korea views the alliance and how reliable they believe the U.S. to still be, the trend is definitely concerning. There are a number of things that the Trump administration has done in these early months that really start to erode confidence, that really start to bring up key issues, core issues that will need to be addressed, but that really, that this isn't how, again, and it's not just South Korea, that really start to question what the U.S. thinks its allies are for as a whole. And we just haven't seen real cooperation going on there.
Youngshik, we've got about a minute left on the programme. Do you agree with what Jenny was saying? Can the US and South Korea get over this? Can they remain the firm allies that they've been for so many decades?
If you define remaining as firm allies by judging South Korea will not side with China as an alternative to the United States, the answer is yes. But as Jenny said, that the damages are increasing, and it is very concerning that the victim country is not just limited to South Korea or Japan, but all the countries. Look at European Union member countries, Canada, Mexico, you name it. How can this country support the Trump administration's effort to curb the rising power of China? Although that does not necessarily mean that these countries will shift their allegiance to China away from the United States. So this is an example of self-defeating behavior of the Trump administration.
There, we're going to have to end it. Many thanks indeed for being with us. Se-Woong Koo, Jenny Town, and Youngshik Bong. Thanks for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website at aljazeera.com. You can join us for further discussion at our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X. Our handle there at AJ Inside Story from me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.